Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive. And this time we're taking a look at something pretty big. We've had a lot of questions about, Trump's potential return to the White House.
hmm
Specifically what that could mean for education. You guys sent in a ton of sources, articles, policy papers, even some firsthand accounts from folks in the education world. And let me tell you, it's a lot to unpack.
Mm.
We're talking, potential dismantling of the Department of Education, battles over what some are calling woke indoctrination in the classroom,
Mhm.
and funding shifts that could really shake things up for schools nationwide.
Yeah, it's definitely a lot to process. I think what's really interesting here, though, is the historical context. We're not just looking at a new president with an agenda. We're looking at a former president coming back potentially
Yeah.
with some unfinished business. So how much of that past experience do you think will kind of shape his approach this time around?
All right, it's like a sequel,
Mm.
but with even higher stakes this time. And one of the biggest questions, or I guess you could say plot twists,
Yeah.
has to be this idea of dismantling the Department of Education. I mean, is that even possible? What would happen to everything the department handles?
hmm
Federal funding, civil rights enforcement, even things like college sports.
Yeah, that's a big question, isn't it? I mean, shutting down the entire department might be legally complex, but Trump could definitely significantly weaken it. Think about it. Programs being moved to other agencies, budgets/staff reduced. Ted Mitchell, the president of the American Council on Education, put it pretty well. He said, even if the department disappears, the functions don't. They have to go somewhere.
Okay, so it's more like a game of bureaucratic musical chairs
Yeah.
than like a complete shutdown. But who picks up the slack if the Department of Education is essentially gutted? Like, who takes on those responsibilities?
Right. Well, that's where things get really interesting. Think about federal grants for low-income schools, which are currently managed through Title I. What if those responsibilities shift to the states? Would they have the resources and infrastructure to handle it? And would funding priorities change under different state leadership?
Right, so we're not talking about an explosion necessarily, but we're talking about a strategic reshuffling
Mm.
with potentially massive consequences. And, it's not just about the money. Trump's also targeting the curriculum itself, specifically what he calls woke indoctrination. What's the reality there, beyond the political rhetoric?
Well, he's definitely tapping into a very real anxiety among some parents. They're concerned about how topics like race and gender are being taught. His website even promises to defund schools teaching critical race theory. But what does that look like in practice? How do you define critical race theory in a curriculum? It's a slippery slope.
Yeah, and then you add in ideas like letting parents directly elect school principals
hmm
or bringing prayer back into public schools. Is this really about giving parents more control, or is it about pushing a specific ideological agenda?
It's probably a bit of both, to be honest. The idea of empowering parents resonates with a lot of people. But critics worry it could lead to a more fragmented and ideologically driven education system. Imagine schools catering to specific viewpoints rather than providing a well-rounded education.
Yeah, that's kind of a scary thought. Like we're talking about shifting the very purpose of education almost. But before we go too far down that road, let's talk about the dollars and cents. What's Trump's plan for school funding, and how could that impact schools, especially those that are already struggling?
Sure. Well, one of his big proposals is converting funding for special education and Title I into block grants. So instead of targeted federal funding, states would get a lump sum, with more flexibility on how to spend it.
Okay, block grants. That sounds like it could be a double-edged sword. More flexibility for states, but also less oversight. And potentially less money going to the schools that need it the most.
Exactly. Imagine a state decides to use that block grant flexibility to divert funds from special education to a school voucher program, for example. That could leave students with disabilities with fewer resources, while potentially benefiting wealthier families who can afford private school tuition.
So a win for some, a definite loss for others. And this is happening at a time when a lot of schools are already facing financial strain, dealing with declining enrollment and the end of those COVID relief funds.
Right. And Margaret Smellings, who was the Secretary of Education under President Bush, she actually warned about this very issue. She argued that schools are already stretched thin, and adding these funding changes on top could be devastating.
Okay, so we've got this potential perfect storm brewing, a reshaped Department of Education, curriculum battles, and funding shifts that could exacerbate existing inequalities. It's a lot to unpack. But what about the students themselves? Who stands to be most impacted by all of this?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Who benefits and who gets left behind? We have to look at the impact on marginalized groups, LGBTQ plus students and students of color.
Yeah, we can't ignore the social and political context here. Trump has been vocal about rolling back certain protections, especially for transgender students. What could happen there?
Well, there are concerns about Title IX, which prohibits sex-based discrimination in education. We could see a weakening of protections for transgender students, making schools less safe and inclusive.
So are we talking about like backsliding on rights that have been hard won?
Yeah.
What about broader civil rights enforcement? If the Department of Education is diminished, who makes sure that schools are treating all students fairly?
That's a huge concern from civil rights advocates. They're saying these changes could just decimate federal oversight, leaving those vulnerable students more susceptible to discrimination. It's a potential step backwards in terms of equity and justice.
Man, it's a pretty stark picture, isn't it? Potential rollback of rights, a more ideologically driven curriculum, and funding changes that can widen the gap between wealthy and disadvantaged schools. It's a lot. And we haven't even touched on higher education.
Oh, that's right. That's another massive piece of this whole puzzle. Think about student loan programs, Pell Grants accreditation, all that falls under the Department of Education. If it's radically altered, the ripple effects on higher education could be enormous.
So we're talking about uncertainty for millions of students, families, and educators. It's like the ground is shifting under the entire education system. But are we overstating things? Is this really a revolution, or are we getting carried away?
It's important to be careful with our language, for sure. But the scale of change Trump is proposing is really significant. He's not just, tweaking policies at the edges. He's aiming to fundamentally reshape how the federal government interacts with education.
That's where things get really interesting, right?
Mm.
It's not just top-down. You have states, school districts, even individual schools pushing back against some of these changes,
Yeah.
or even embracing them.
Margaret Spellings, who we mentioned before, she made a good point about that. She said local school districts, especially those facing budget constraints, they're going to resist anything that puts more financial pressure on them.
So you could end up with this tug of war then,
Hmm.
between Trump's agenda and the reality on the ground. Some states aligning with his vision, others resisting, and others trying to find some kind of middle ground.
Exactly. You could have a patchwork of different approaches across the country, and that could make those inequalities between states even worse.
Yeah. So a potential splintering of the education system, different states going in totally different directions. It's like we're talking about different realities of education, depending on where you live.
Yeah, that's a very real possibility. And it raises some serious questions about equity and access. What if some states double down on more traditional values, while others embrace more progressive approaches? What happens to students who move between states? How do we ensure a quality education for everyone, no matter where they live?
It's kind of mind-boggling. We're not just talking about policy debates. This is about real-world consequences for students, teachers, families, entire communities, really.
That's why staying informed and engaged is so important, especially at the local level. School board meetings, community forums, these are going to be the battlegrounds where all of this plays out.
So it's not just about watching what happens in Washington. It's about paying attention in our own backyards.
Exactly. This isn't a spectator sport. It's about understanding the nuances, the potential unintended consequences, and all the different perspectives at play. It's about being an active participant in shaping the future of education.
It's easy to get lost in the big picture drama, but this is about individual students and their learning experiences. How do these changes play out in classrooms? How do they affect teachers? What are the long-term consequences for the kids themselves?
Those are the questions we should be asking. We can't lose sight of the human element here. In the midst of all the political maneuvering, it's about making sure that every student, no matter their background or where they live, has the opportunity to thrive.
So we've covered a lot. Potential dismantling of the Department of Education.
Yeah.
The battle over curriculum and ideology. The impact of funding shifts. The potential consequences for marginalized students. And all the uncertainty surrounding higher education. What's the key takeaway? What should our listeners be thinking about as this potential education revolution unfolds?
Yeah, it feels like we're really on the edge of something big here, a potential seismic shift in American education, with Trump maybe driving these huge changes from the top down, but also facing pushback and, a whole range of reactions from different states and communities. It's a lot to take in.
It really is. And I think that's why it's so important to remember the historical context here. We're not just talking about a new president with some ideas. We're talking about a former president, someone who's coming back with experience, a clearer vision, maybe even a sense of urgency.
Exactly. It's like almost like a political and educational time warp. He's not starting from scratch. He's building on what he already tried to do, maybe learning from what worked and what didn't.
So for someone who's trying to make sense of all this, what are the big things to watch for? What are the signs that we're headed for a full-blown revolution?
Right.
Or just, something more like a gradual evolution?
I think one key thing will be how he handles the Department of Education. If he really goes all in on dismantling it, that's a huge sign. It means we could see a real upheaval across the whole education system. But if he takes a more, you know, strategic approach, maybe focuses on other parts of his agenda, it could mean he's willing to compromise.
So the level of disruption at the federal level is something to watch, but what about at the state level? What should people be paying attention to in their own communities?
Well, keep an eye on school board elections and local debates. Are candidates running on platforms that align with Trump's vision? Are communities divided over things like the curriculum funding or parental rights? The level of engagement at the local level will tell you a lot.
So it's not just about Washington. It's about what's happening in our own backyards.
Absolutely. Education is local, even when it's influenced by federal policy. And what works in one place might not work in another. So it's crucial to get involved. Voice your concerns and advocate for what you believe in.
So stay informed, stay engaged, and buckle up.
Yeah.
Because it sounds like it's going to be a pretty wild ride.
I think that's good advice. But I'd also say, think about the long game. What are the long-term consequences of all of this? How will it shape education in America? What kind of legacy will it leave behind?
Those are some big questions.
Yeah, but they're the right questions. We're not just talking about 4 years. This could change education for generations.
That's a lot of responsibility.
It is. And it's a responsibility we all share, whether we're policymakers, parents, teachers, or just concerned citizens. The future of education is in our hands. And the decisions we make today will have a real impact.
Well said. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We've covered a lot of ground: the Department of Education, the curriculum funding marginalized students' higher education. It's a complex situation. But by staying informed, getting involved, and thinking critically, you can help shape the future of education. Keep asking those tough questions. And keep pushing for the kind of education system we all deserve. We'll see you next time on The Deep Dive.